Welcome to part 2 of the Simon McGarr podcast. This, in my opinion, is the definitive interview on data and why we all need to wake up to why it's so important. If knowledge is power, then data is a valuable currency and we need to be very careful about just giving it away. I hope you enjoyed as much as we did.
Yeah, that's probably it.
I'm going to pull us back towards the data protection or the public services card. And I'm going to ask a question. It's a very personal question to me. I had noticed that the RSA was looking, and that's the Road Safety Authority, wouldn't accept a passport or any other form of ID, only the public services card when you made an application for provisional license. Now, you've looked very closely. I've seen you've had quite a bit of to and fro with the RSA.
Yes, I asked for the legal basis for that requirement. Now, I'm struck by that because, as I said, there are a whole series of cohorts of people over whom the government has the capacity to exert influence. So, if it is the case that you rely upon your social welfare payments, and the threat, implicit or explicit, is that if you do not sign up for a public services card, you will not receive your social welfare payments either now or in the future. And that explicit threat was made in letters out to social welfare recipients. Then the chances of having a heavy amount of take-up is very high. The risk to you for making a stand, which some people did do, and they lost money. There was one lady who had her pension cut off because she simply said, I won't do that unless you show me the legal basis for doing this. She didn't say, I won't prove who I am. She was happy to prove who she was.
Yes.
She just wouldn't sign up for the card. So there are cohorts of people over whom the state can exert influence. And this is, in European law terms, this is known as compelled consent or not true consent.
Yeah.
So you may get consent, but if you compelled it, either because, and the most famous example is compelled consent between employees and employers, government and someone over which they have power. When you have those kinds of lines of influence, asynchronous power structures, it's very difficult to get uncompelled consent without an awful lot of explanation being provided.
Actually, I have a very good example of this. I knew about the public services card long before most people knew about the public services card. I was on chemo, I was on a disability pension, and I got this letter through the door that says, you must sign up for your public services card as part of being on a disability payment. Now, normally, I'd argue to the eye teeth with people over
But you couldn't.
stuff. I couldn't. I wasn't in a position to do it.
And,
I simply couldn't.
And most people aren't. And that's why, I mean, I'll finish my point in relation to the thing, and I'll say generally, the RSA, therefore, is a pinch point for people, particularly young people. This only applies to people applying for their first provisional license. It doesn't apply to repeat. I've had one provisional license. You'll notice I also said I can't drive. But I sat the exam and the driver tester got out afterwards and shouted at me and accused me of never been behind the wheel before. And I haven't sat the second one since. However, the RSA are generally finding that there are young people apply for the first provisionals. And this is a moment where young people either knuckle under and go and get a PSC, or in the alternative, they don't, but then they can't drive. Now, the RSA has a particularly interesting example. Is there a legal basis, I said? And the legal basis that they provided was not a legal basis for this. What they say is, one, their first response was, the Department of Welfare tells us that there is.
Yes.
Well, that's not a great response from a licensing agency, and that's what this is. Because the Department of Social Protection can make its own decisions about what is legal and what isn't, and it takes the consequences. But similarly, you make your decisions about what is and isn't legal, and you take the consequences in respect of whether you got it right or wrong.
Similarly,
you can't rely on someone else's legal advice. The next question is, okay, is there a legal basis? And they came back again and they said, actually, yes, the Department of Social Protection says this is the legal basis. I went and read it, it had no legal basis. It didn't relate to the thing that they were doing.
Yes.
So the final question is, well, if you can't give a legal basis, and you're the government agency doing it, let us then agree that certainly it's arguable, and I'm arguing it, that there is no legal basis. So, what happens with licensing authorities where, without a legal basis, they introduce new conditions to getting a license? That's what this is. You're not able to sit the driver theory test unless you give them the number on your public services card.
Yes.
If you give them the number, you can sit the test. If you don't, you can't. If you can't sit the test, you can't get a license. It is therefore a new condition. Now, the thing is, you see, that we've already had a Supreme Court case
Yes.
which deals with the question of what powers licensing agencies can have to introduce new conditions not written into legislation.
Okay.
What happened was that there was a case in relation to the issuing of gun licenses. The Oireachtas had made up a whole long list of things that you had to have in order to get a gun license. You had to go through a whole set of hoops. One person was going through all the hoops. And the licensing authority, the analogy is not perfect, but the agency who gave out the license was the Gardaí.
Right.
And a circular had been issued from, I think it was from a superintendent, saying, here's an additional step that I want people who want to get guns have to go through. And the facts don't really matter in relation to having a safe and the guards being able to come in and look at it, memory serves. But I mean, what's important is, what the question that went to the Supreme Court was, if you are an agency which is handed a set of rules and told these people have to follow those rules or they don't get the license, and the person follows all the rules, are you permitted to introduce new rules which prevent them from getting the license if they don't follow them? And the answer the Supreme Court gave was no, because that would put the licensing agency, the creature who is the agent and enforcing the Oireachtas, in the position, the Oireachtas laws, in the position of having the same powers as the Oireachtas to pass laws. The Oireachtas have passed a set of laws. You can't change the law. You can't introduce new things or take things out. Those are the rules.
But
you're to enforce them.
But de facto, the RSA has taken your passport out and replaced it with the public services card. De facto.
Well, what has happened is that the RSA has introduced a new condition.
Yes.
And the condition is that you must get a public services card. That's
Which
the
again-
condition.
Which is again compelled consent.
Yes, I mean, there's no consent. You have to go and do it, or you don't get a thing.
I mean,
and I say that is analogous with what is already decided by the Supreme Court as being not permitted.
I actually went up I applied for a provisional license for a motorcycle, and I used to have one years ago, and I said, right, we'll test the system. So I went up and I applied for it, and I'm in the RSA, and on the wall are these posters, Pometric, and I'm like, what the hell is going on here? What is going on? And of course, I'm very bolshy. When they asked for the public services card, I said, no, I'm not giving you my public services card. There's my passport. You can, that's the rules. Use the passport. No, you can't do this unless you give us your public services card. And I said, okay, I'll give it to you, but you must note that I am giving this to you under protest, that I am under duress to give it to you to get the provisional license, and which they did. But the listed bodies, the RSA is down as a listed body, but they give the data to Pometric, and within Pometric's agreement, their data agreement, you actually sign off to agree that they can send information to the United States. Now, they're saying they don't, but you actually agree that they can.
Yes, and I mean, there are three things packed together there.
Yes.
Question one, is it legitimate to pass information between a state agency and a private agency, data processor on their behalf? Well, the answer is, it is, but only if there is a data processing agreement between the two entities which covers all the necessary protections. And if there isn't such a written agreement between the two entities, then it isn't. So that's one question. The next question is it legitimate that your information will be taken in here and passed to the United States? And the answer there is only under actually quite unusual circumstances, under what was previously the safe harbour, which was struck down, and is now the Privacy Shield Agreement. There are certain methods by which you can do that, but explicitly in the consent, which is online, which they ask you to sign up as when you're trying to apply for this license, it doesn't cite the safe harbour or the the Privacy Shield as the basis for transfer, and rather it relies, if I recall correctly, on consent.
And it's not actually consent.
They're asking you to consent now. But remember, again, is this true consent or is this compelled consent? After all, we were withholding your ability to drive, which is as I can attest, is part of people's ability to travel around. It limits their job capacity and so on. It's important for people to be able to drive, and for some people it's critical. And under those circumstances, is that compelled consent or not? I think it probably is compelled consent. Again, it's the exertion of the asynchronous power between a state and a citizen. And the only thing a citizen has in their armoury to defend against a state is to be able to say, actually, these are the rules.
Yeah.
So immediately following that, I wrote to the Data Protection Commissioner. I basically said, look, they're taking my data. I don't want them to have my data. They're using the Public Services Card. They've no right to use this Public Services Card. And since then, Data Protection Commissioner has written to me, or office has written to me twice, fobbed me off twice, and I'm now at the position like, will I bother writing to them again? I've made a very specific complaint. They simply haven't addressed it. I asked for the legislation, and they couldn't point me to the legislation. They basically said, well, social welfare have said this, but, yeah.
Yes, but since you did that, I suspect, something has changed. Because although you may have thought that you were being fobbed off, my feeling is that you weren't the only person who complained about public services cards and its activities. And then something new happened in September or October 2017. And that was, for the very first time ever, the Data Protection Commissioner asked the state to legally justify a project that was going on, which was the Public Services Card.
Yeah. Huh?
The state produced a document answering many, many questions. They published this document, so I can tell you what I thought of it, and I thought it was gobbledygook.
Okay.
It was incredibly poor, if these were to be the answers to these questions, and this was the state's best position put forward. And I'm clearly not the only person who wasn't exactly satisfied with the outcome of that, because having received the answers and read them, for the first time ever, the Data Protection Commissioner has launched an inquiry into the processing under Section 10. She has powers under Section 10 to launch an inquiry off her own bat, not on foot of complaints, but on foot of her own initiative. And that's the first time that has ever happened to any state project. So here is 57 pages of answers. I read it, I realise that's the best you can do, and I then open an inquiry. That tells me something about the quality of the answers.
Absolutely.
And we were discussing this earlier. There are some major penalties if this turns out to be somebody's...
I had a conversation about this when I was giving evidence in the Oireachtas. We were giving evidence in relation to implementation of the GDPR. So there's a bill being brought forward by the Department of Justice to implement the General Data Protection Regulation. It has automatic effect in most areas, and in other areas there are choices. So, for example, we can choose at what age children are allowed to agree to, sign up to Facebook and so on without having their parental consent. Mm-hmm. So we get little dials we can choose, and so the bill covers all of those things. But one of the things I said when I was giving evidence was, if we don't get these projects right, if we have large-scale state projects dealing with personal data, the consequences of getting them wrong following the passage of the GDPR are eye-watering. Because what you'll hear if you go out into industry is everybody's talking about the potential fines.
Yes.
Now, the state has written a bill currently, the Oireachtas Committee, I proposed, and the Oireachtas Committee has accepted the proposal that this should be removed. But the state has currently proposed a bill where they're exempt from fines. And that's the current position of the bill. We'll see what it looks like after, because the committee said they didn't think they should be exempt from fines.
Yeah.
Because the fines aren't a draw on the exchequer.
No.
Because the money just goes back into the state. But what happens is they're a way of keeping score as to who is and isn't if we see a regular fine being levied on one particular area of the state, what we know is we've got a problem there.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a method of keeping track.
But we've looked at the Public Services Card. We've looked at what, if any, legislation there is behind it. We've looked at ownership, biometric, compulsory, mandatory, and this is where it all comes down to. When you put all data in one place, when it goes wrong, it goes spectacularly
The problem
wrong.
is the numbers, the pure numbers that you're dealing with. Because what you are is, you're looking at a system which is one of, and I counted them up, and I think there are something like 8 or 9 databases which aspire to contain the contents of the entire population.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that means that they aspire to be full citizen databases. In fact, some of them go beyond that, and they aspire to collect the information of people who are just resident but not citizens. So, for example, the HSE wishes to set up a database covering every single person in Ireland.
That's right.
And giving them all a number and then collecting up their data, associating it with their medical history and so on
with the
and so
public
forth.
services card.
And associating it with the public services. The mind boggles. By the way, and I think there are serious issues in relation to that, and there are parts of that legislation which are blatantly on their face contrary to European law.
Yeah.
There are pieces of the legislation. That legislation, for example, in respect to the HSE's database, the Individual Health Identifiers database, and the e-health electronic health records, there's an element of that which says that the Data Protection Commissioner, if they receive complaints, they may look into the matter. But it limits the Data Protection Commissioner's power to making a report to the Minister for Health afterwards. Now, you can't limit the Data Protection Commissioner's power. The Data Protection Commissioner herself has said this is a breach of the right to independence. I've said before, you can't legislate something that is illegal. You can't make it legal by passing a law.
Just passing a law.
That law is wrong on its face. And the consequences of that we'll see pan out over the next couple of years. And the reason that I say that these things are so significant is, let us imagine there is an erroneous processing of data. People's rights have been breached, that they were collected illegally, that it was shared illegally on a mass scale. Okay. Well, but nobody loses any money as a result of it. The famous non-financial loss. What is the consequence of that? Well, we had a case in Ireland measuring what a non-financial loss was. A Collins case. It was called Collins versus FBD, I think, if memory serves. And there was a gentleman who went in. He discovered that there had been a breach in relation to his personal data, and he took a case in relation to that breach. Now, the loss was measured. The value of that was measured at the Circuit Court as being, if memory serves, €15,000.
Okay.
That's non-financial loss.
Yeah. But that's reputational or good
No,
name?
No. It's like general damages in tort.
Okay.
That's the repair for having your rights breached.
Okay.
If there is a right, there must be a remedy if the right has been breached. There is, of course, what's known as special damages in tort, which is the things that you were going through, which are things like, oh, well, it cost me money, or I lost my job, and we measure the value of that. That's a cash sum, and we can do it on a teller. But as well as that, there's a general damages element in respect of any tort. Now, in the UK, they actually created a new tort when they got this, under what's known as the Vidal Hall judgment, which went all the way to the UK Court of Appeal. In fact, I think it went to the House of Lords. But the result was that they actually said yes, and they measured it at £10,000 sterling. So you can see that we kind of have a tariff.
More or less.
Here in Ireland, the Collins judgment was appealed to the High Court, and O'Dell will argue, and I think he's correct, that the High Court erroneously said there was no recovery for non-financial loss under current EU law, and therefore he reversed, the High Court reversed the decision in favour of Mr. Collins.
Okay.
But that's not to say that the tariff was incorrect. It was simply that there was a decision in respect of what the law was. But what we do know is that the GDPR explicitly says there is recovery for non-financial loss.
Okay.
And we now have a tariff, and we've seen what the tariff is in the UK, and we've seen what the tariff is
We have
per
a
person,
ballpark.
per loss, let's say €10,000.
Yes.
Okay, let's say it. Multiply that by the number of people who are in the
Public
Service Card database.
Yeah.
Let's say it's the population of Ireland minus a bunch of people. So let's say it's 3 million.
Yeah.
Now, almost any number that you multiply by 3 million is a very large number.
Just about.
Yeah.
Now, we had a terrible problem in this state because the army deafness cases
Yes.
were extremely expensive. I think it ran to a couple of billion by the time that they had paid off. The pool of people affected was
small,
minuscule compared to the pool of people affected when you run and set up databases covering an entire population. I cannot understand why this level of risk is being taken on by the state, because I think that it is eye-watering levels of risk, given that they cannot, even to themselves or to the general public, give the legal basis on which it is okay. And that level of risk to the exchequer, which is eventually to the public purse, is unjustifiable unless there was some screaming compelling reason. And even when you ask for the reasons, you get sort of generalities about how it would make things easier if we could come up with the ways in which it would make things easier.
But that's if officially it goes wrong. I mean, we have hackers now who have hacked the Indian database.
That's a separate instance. And of course that is true. You could end up with a data breach which involved people's information leaking into the public. And that in itself would be a disaster.
Yes.
Because you would lose. In South Korea, there was a breach of their extremely comprehensive national identity database. Everybody was issued with an identity number. It was used in everything. You'd order the milk and you'd use your identity number. Everything was using the national identity number. They lost a huge wodge of it. It all went online. And they had to spend, I can't remember how many billion, but literally billions trying to reissue everybody with a new number. The president of South Korea had his identity stolen because the thing had gone.
And that's the thing about biometric data. You can't. It's not like a bank card. You can't
try and reissue everybody with a new face.
Yeah.
It's quite difficult. It's actually quite hard. I was speaking to somebody who used to work in a large multinational, and they had looked at whether or not they would use fingerprints as the put in a fingerprint reader to get around the places, had these cards, and they were thinking, oh, look at the increased security. But the problem was that if there was a breach, if you just needed to issue a new card to everybody, happy days.
Yeah.
But it was quite hard to think, well, we're going to have to clip off everybody's thumbs and put on new thumbs, and they decided they wouldn't do it because it actually wasn't good security; it was bad security.
But even in this, there's subtle things that nobody has yet even looked at. And I'm going to pick something very simple, which is the bus pass. In previous times, you had a bus pass, you showed it to the driver, you got on the bus, that's it. He knew you got on the bus. Nobody else had a record of it. Now you scan your bus pass, they can tell where you get on, where you get off, how many journeys you make. And this is all data now that nobody knows who owns this data, who has access to this data, why is this data even being generated?
If we are to have collections of personal data, we must know why they're there, otherwise it's illegal. There must be a reason for it, otherwise it's illegal.
Yeah.
There must be a moment at which point we say we no longer need it for that reason, and then we delete it, otherwise it's illegal.
And there could be great reasons to have that. There could be great reasons to have all that data if you were a behavioural economist and you wanted to know how these were being used and where we're getting value for money from it. And
if it's anonymised.
This is my point.
Yeah.
So
on aggregate,
yes.
that could be very valuable data.
So Martin, like, it's not all conspiracy, but where we are is we just don't have the justifications for a lot of these from the state, and we have a state that's tripped over itself, that's gone, we come back to the FOIs and Ken Fox and the video that went up of Leo saying, I don't like this card. It sounds very much like a national identity card when he was a minister.
Yes.
Then 4 years later, standing up saying this card is not a national identity card, and the minister has my full support for this card, and you're going. And then all of a sudden, all the videos got taken down 48 hours later. The videos from of his previous thing got removed from the Oireachtas website. Now, again,
state is a strangely emotional thing. For an inanimate object, it has strangely emotional reactions.
Because it's made up of people.
Yeah. And yet, the reactions are such that you would not expect individuals to be so strongly emotional. In a way, the state is more emotional than if you're dealing with a person who will exercise restraint and recognises that, if I go bananas at you one day, there would be consequences later the next time I have to deal with you. And yet the state doesn't have those kind of restraints, I think. And frequently you'll find that people who deal with the state a lot, and particularly in things like, where you're trying to persuade the state of a particular position, or even if you're in litigation or even in a dispute or anything like that, that it is more guided by emotional impulses than you would expect an entity that is basically a collection of headed papers.
But maybe this brings us to what Tony was talking about. You had a thread up recently about your and you and Tony are the same general generation. Tony, if you want to have
I'm the older bit of it.
Slightly older, slightly wiser, much more, and I'm very humble. No, I just thought it was very interesting.
Older and wider, I would say, is the primary issue.
that we spoke about the fact that our generation had the generational change even in politics this year that we've seen over the last 12 months, whereby the Taoiseach is 38, the Taoiseach is in his early 40s, there's a turnover in politics, there's a turnover in we were. I think you referred to it as the top of the baby boom. Where
I am the peak of the baby boom. I was born in 1976. If you look at the demographics on the CSO, I am that was the year in which there was the very maximum number of babies born over that giant bulge in the 1970s going into the early 1980s. And so all my life, and I think this is interesting, all my life I have gone through life with society, certainly the commercial elements of society, rearranging themselves to suit my interests as to where I am in my life cycle at that moment. So, because just on basic numbers, if you are running a business and you look out the window and you discover that there's a whole bunch of people who have all reached the point where they all would like to go get married now, you will find that a whole lot of businesses pop up to service that wish.
Yes.
Now, imagine your entire life is like that. There is a strange kind of an experience which isn't shared by the generation before us and wasn't shared by the generation after us.
Certainly not the generation.
Absolutely, definitely not by the generation that's currently between 15 and 27, which is, by the way, numerically extremely small due to the extreme impact of emigration on that generation at the moment. If you look at the CSO's demographics, we are the bulk of the population.
You guys are basically the Truman Show.
Well, everything has been bent around us commercially,
yes.
But politically, everything has always been in the hands of old men, as it looked. And it has never been the case. This is the thing that I'm saying. It has never been the case that I have ever felt that the state was being run by people who shared my experiences.
We used to refer to the generation just above as the Jagger generation. Do you remember the phrase, the Jagger generation, that had partied a little bit, and then they'd come in to say they'd bought houses when houses were 20,000, and they'd managed to, and then when our generation were hitting that the difficulties of the last decade, they had actually, most of them had gone beyond that and were able to absorb the loss, because even if a drop of 80% was still nothing on a grain of 800% to these people, whereas we were now looking at, to go back to David McWilliams' Pope's Children.
It's the same generation.
Yes, it's that generation.
The same generation.
And as you said, commercially, the world bent to our will. At the time.
Not consciously. I mean, I wasn't consciously
but
controlling
that's
anything. It's just I happened to go on to get married at a moment where wedding fairs popped up all the time.
It's a numerical.
That suddenly there were an awful lot of baby shops to cater to my needs in the local area when I had children.
Simon, you've been really good, and we're really thrilled that you came in and did this with us, because this needed this long talk, this long exposure to go through what exactly is going on here. But you have a few rules of thumb that you would like to get out there first when dealing with issues of this kind.
Look, I do appear to be a nutter. I'm conscious of that, but I actually am not a nutter. What it is that what happens is, let us imagine that you have specialised knowledge in something.
Yeah.
And you're the person who knows about it. I do feel that you have a duty, if that specialised knowledge could assist other people, that you have to tell them about it. The problem is you're the only one who knows about it, or you and a very small number of your fellow aficionados of this specialised knowledge, whether it be data protection, pigeon fancying, whatever it is.
Yes.
And you're the person who holds that information. Well, unfortunately, therefore, you can't rely on general information gathering that people will absorb by osmosis. You have to walk around telling people about it. And it's got to be the people who know about it who say about it, talk about it. The result is that I end up talking about data protection. And I look like I'm a person who's just always talking about data protection.
Yeah.
It doesn't fill my every waking moment. I mean, there's also eating. But what I do know is that having gone through a couple of things where I've had to say, look, actually, this doesn't work. So, for example, with the pod, I told you originally the intention was to hold the information on 5-year-olds until they were 35, at least, and then indefinitely. And what I did was, over the course of 2 years of banging on, like, I know it looked like I was a nutter, but I actually had a plan. And what you do is you decide where is the points in this scheme where there are points of weakness,
vulnerabilities. Yeah.
Where do you focus your attention? If you complain about the scheme, you feel better, but you've been useless.
Yes.
Don't do that. Rather, explain why it is that the scheme is wrong in XYZ point. Be specific. Set out those specifics. Go and do a bunch of research to prove that what you say is correct. Show all your research so everybody who doesn't know you, and you shouldn't presume anybody knows you, show all the research. Use a lot of footnotes in order that people can say, oh, actually, I can see where he got to there. He got it from this bunch of facts here. And then present that, and then just keep presenting it. And what happens is that people will gradually go, that sounds like it sounds reasonable, let's find what the other side says. And if the other side goes blarp and can't explain their position to the same level that you are, what will be accepted then is generally, that's a better argument.
Yes.
Yeah.
Once you have an argument which is generally accepted as a better argument, you will be allowed by simply the society wishing to... I mean, this is just society wishing to minimise the amount of noise in its life. Let's only hear from people who appear to have functioning arguments. So you will be allowed then to make your argument at a kind of a wider level. So, for example, when I was making arguments against Pod, I was invited on. Once I'd made the argument, and I would argue won the argument,
Yes.
but I had no impact yet, but I had made a good argument. I was then invited on to make my argument on the radio, and I'm capable of doing that, and also I'm a reassuring presence if you're running a radio program. I'm a lawyer, and so they feel reassured that I'm not going to be libeling anyone. And also they feel reassured that if they book me in for a 10-minute slot, I will be able to talk for 10 minutes. I think that is safe to say.
Just about.
And so therefore that's one of those reassurances where you can say, well, look, this person looks like they could actually come on the program, make their position, and we could hear from the other side. And what happened there was the other side, which is the civil service generally. Remember, it is not the ministers. Do not focus on the ministers. Ministers have only 2 powers in their lives. Only 2 powers. They should really go in and there should be 2 buttons on their desk. And the button is, one is marked start and one is marked stop. And those are their 2 powers. You have the power to say to the civil service who come to you, we have a plan.
Yeah.
And they say, we have a plan and we wish to do this. And as the minister, your power is to press the green button to say yes. And you also have a button which is generally dusty and covered in cobwebs because they're much slower to do this. You have the power to say, about that plan that you're currently doing,
It's not working.
Stop it.
Yes.
Now, it is the rare and valuable minister who presses the stop button. But it is the cheery, happy minister. They'd sit there all day hitting the start button if they could. Because every time you hit the start button, you announce a thing you're doing.
You get to do it. You get
a
a photo up.
And the problem is that if you don't hit the stop button, the state carries on with what becomes zombie projects.
Yes.
And the state is not the ministers. Focusing on the ministers is to miss the point. The state is not the elected entities. The state is the institution that the elected entities are sitting on top of. So if you wish to make a campaign in relation to something, if you want to make an argument which can have a political impact out in the wider world, if it's the case that you want to have some effective political action that you want to take, and this is at any level, national, local council, whatever it is, the paths aren't working properly. What you need to do is this. First of all, you need to look at it and you need to say, what is the problem? Identify the problem. And mostly your first impulse will be to say, I feel this is bad. That's great. It's going to drive you, but it's not going to persuade anyone. So stop talking about your feelings. Next question. Move on to the question of, well, why is it bad? Define it for yourself. Once you've defined it for yourself and you can actually just describe it, why is this wrong? And I mean, for example, the thing that I was saying to you in relation to both the pod and the public services card, my short description, why is this wrong? It's because I don't believe that there's a legal basis for doing it.
Yes.
That is the reason. Define that, and then you know what it is that you have to focus on demonstrating. Now demonstrate, why is that true? You go along and you have to do a whole bunch of work and you might have to send off FOIs and it might take you a couple of months. But listen, you were going to live through those months anyway.
Yes.
You might as well go and do something with it. Time was going to pass regardless. I mean, people say that takes ages. And well, look, it was last July it was 2014 I started doing that. I'm still now. The time was going to pass anyway.
Yes,
I might as well do something with it.
Well, I'm like 19 years in bogus self-employment, so you
just carry on doing things,
Mm.
and there you are, and you get to the end. So, okay, things take a long time, they do. But, you don't have a news cycle. You're not required to publish on any particular day.
No.
Nobody is interested in what you have to say unless you have something to say. So not looking for thirsting for content. I'm speaking generally. Obviously, you two have to feed the content monster now once a week. But generally speaking, you can just wait.
Yeah.
So all the things that cause professional journalists to go mad, that things take so long, that there being delays. What? You're going to die before it happens? As long as you're not going to die before it happens, it doesn't matter.
Yes.
Just keep going.
Yeah.
So eventually you're going to gather sufficient information to be able to say definitively, my position is actually a good one and here's the reasons. So now you put forward your reasons. Now you have to. You could do that away on a Tumblr and nobody's read you. But much more useful is if you then take that to somewhere where people can see your reasons, and you persuade people to agree with you. The most effective thing you can do if you wish to change anything in Ireland is to have a person appear at a TD's clinic. That is the most effective political action.
Your own TD's clinic.
Your own TD's clinic. No TD cares about the people who aren't in their constituency. Those are all basically Playmobil characters as far as they're concerned. The only dramatis personae are the people who live in their own constituency. For a human being to turn up at a clinic is an enormous effort.
Yes.
Now, I'll give you an example. What are the kind of rules of thumb that you could expect to do if you're doing mass mobilisation? Now, mass mobilisation online is very difficult, but it's a lot easier than doing it offline. So let's imagine that you've reduced the friction as much as possible, and you actually have 80,000 people. And I picked that figure because when we did the Stop Soap Ireland campaign, we had a petition, and we got 82,000 or 84,000 signatures within 2 weeks. So that was big and it was fast.
Yes.
The signatures alone were demonstrating that this was an active topic.
Yeah.
And yet it was an active topic which had appeared from nowhere as far as the media were concerned, because it falls outside most of the general media's beats. It's not a topic that was a discussion at all at the time. It was just one of these things. And yet suddenly it exploded as far as they were concerned. What they didn't realise was, and this is the question in relation to generational shared interests and shared experiences, that the people that they were used to hearing from as to what the news was did not share the same life experience as to the importance of free and access to the internet that the generation where the bulk of the voters were.
Yes.
That is the major difference in that generational change. The voters are now the people who are also represented at the top.
Yeah.
That numbers have now spoken. So you now have to try and find it. So if you've 80,000 people, how many of those people can you get to turn up? Well, of the 80,000 people, you say, will you please do for me the following? And you ask them to do something fairly low impact. Let's say, send an email. But only to your own TD.
Yeah.
Don't send an email to all TDs. You might as well send it to your own spam box. Nobody wants that to happen, and you have negated the power that you could have held if you actually had contacted it in a more focused way.
Yes.
So, for God's sake, only contact your own TD. And all of the 80,000 people, all of different TDs, find a way that they can say, I live here, tell them who their TD is, and tell them what the contact detail is. Remove every layer of friction. Every time you have a layer of friction in any of these, you're going to lose significant percentage of points.
That's why no one gives us a review. They have to click on 3 buttons.
There's too many. There's too many. It's too hard to give a review to anyone. That's why every podcast ends with some sort of pathetic pleading to leave us a review.
I'm hiding in the corner here.
It's humiliating for the listener, and it's embarrassing for the speaker, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So, and nonetheless, nobody does it. Why? Because you don't click your ear holes, and that's where you are. It's friction. So if you reduce the friction, you increase the take up of anything. So what you need is you've got to have an element where you say, here's your TD. It's your TD. Click this button, and that's the action you're asking them to do. But, oh God, what do I say to the TD? Present them with a selection of things that they could mix and match, that they could cut and paste, and then put a bit in where they gave their own opinion.
Yes.
Because that's the thing that makes it unique, and that's where you get that human element. Posting off photocopied letters and saying, look, we had a submission of 10 billion submissions, and all 10 billion submissions all have identical. Well, you stop, you had one submission, and you just had a lot of copies of it.
Yes.
That's how it's thought. But if you get a load of people with their individual opinions, that's what makes the difference in respect of what is the impact of this. But let's say you wanted to go further. Of the 80,000, you'll get 8,000 to do the first task. But let's say you really want to go big. Let's say you want to say, I'd like you to turn up physically in a place, visit a TD, come to a march, come to a meeting, anything.
Yes.
Of that 10%, the 8,000, you're now going to get 10% of those who might respond. So if you increase the original number high enough, 800 people visiting their TDs on a particular day, if you arrange it, is an enormous wall of impact. You have succeeded in creating an impact.
Yeah.
In that case, in the Stop Soap Ireland campaign, we ended up with a debate, the only debate that has ever been the case, a debate on a statutory instrument, which was not then put to a vote. It was the most extraordinary debate that I've ever witnessed in the Dáil. The system had to react in some way.
Yeah.
I used the same method in respect of encouraging people to write to the Department of Foreign Affairs in respect of expelling the papal nuncio after the Murphy report came out,
Yes.
and the papal nuncio had refused to cooperate.
With the
Papal nuncio is a religious institution, but the papal nuncio is also a diplomatic institution.
political.
There are no points to be had complaining that the church isn't doing X, Y, Z. The church doesn't answer to you. It can do what it likes. But the state answers to you, and the one point of overlap between the church and the state is the papal nuncio, and so that's where you focus the attention. And from the Department of Foreign Affairs' point of view, they didn't understand why, but they started getting letters. And they got a lot of letters. I know, because I FOI'd the file afterwards. They got a lot of letters. Sufficient that within 1 week, the story went from how excellent and helpful the papal nuncio had been. Brian Cowan had his speech rewritten the day he stood up to make the response to the Murphy report, to put in a defence of the papal nuncio into it in order to meet this.
Yeah.
It went from that position to that collapsing, I think after 4 days, and Micheál Martin calling in the papal nuncio and giving out to him and waving a sheaf of letters he had received.
Yes.
That's impact.
Well, I
You've
think
changed government policy, and you've changed it because you've delivered just at the point where there is a weak point. You've delivered the pressure. If you don't understand where the weak point is, you can just blarp on about how it's not good that the church did X, Y, Z for as long as you like. You can blarp on about how I think that this statutory instrument is a bad idea and there's copyright issues, but there are also other human rights issues. You can blarp on about I think that it's bad that I have to give this information to schools and they give it on to the Department of Education. If you bring understanding past that point,
well,
if you go past how you feel and actually can work out where you need to go,
this is something
you can bring about change.
This is a discussion we've had with other people on the podcast, and I think it's very informative that this is a route we can use. Instead, we've been talking about street protests, blah blah, and stuff like that, and you've just identified a pathway, a more effective pathway to get things across, to get subjects across, and with something I think we can bring to the rest of the the group.
I'm not a political person in the sense of, I can't remember. The last street protest I recall I was walking on was it was the one just before the Iraq War, and the last one before that was probably when my parents took me along holding a black balloon on Ronald Reagan's visit to Ireland. So you can see there's a big gap between the two.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah.
So that's me. But what I do think is that this is a model by which the benefits of the internet in reducing that friction that we talk about.
Well, it's adapting to a new situation.
To allow for citizens to be more active in their society.
Yeah.
And this is really what I would say to you. This is about citizens being active. And if you have a society where citizens are inactive, the society goes wrong.
Yeah.
The citizens' rights cease to become the thing that people focus on, and you end up with the drift between the institutional aims and the citizens' aims and rights becoming so wide as to cause a crisis. And where you have an active citizenry, you have a check on that drift. And really you end up with a far healthier society. Whatever the citizens are active about,
Yes, yeah.
it doesn't matter.
No, it doesn't.
Simon, I want to thank you for coming in, and it's been, without doubt, one of the best pods we've done. Now, unfortunately, Tony's got to go and look for stars and reviews and do the...
I'm going to get down and...
Go on, abase yourself before your listeners.
Oh, you're such kind folk. And, we have this conversation, and I go, yeah. And every time I try to write this little...
Watch, here's a little spiel. Okay, listeners, that was dull. Unless you want more of it, you're going to have to give a really high mark. Otherwise, they're just going to keep putting this in your earholes. But if you do give them a high mark, and if you go and you leave a review and say, well, after that, I've never experienced such relief when a podcast ended. If you can say something along those lines and give them lots of stars, what happens is that other people listen, and they're going to have to dilute it. Like, if they go mass market, they're going to have something that, human beings could listen to. If you want to be a human being and be fed noise into your ears that humans could listen to, give them a high mark.
That's it. Wrapped up, Tony.
Thanks
Thank you very much,
Simon.
Simon.
It's been a pleasure.